For more on the wildfires, to speak now to Dr. S. Muthu Kumaran, Assistant Research Professor at the Department of Fire Protection Engineering at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Professor Kumaran, thank you for joining us. I want to start by asking you about, the wildfires. We tend to speak of it as one, but there are two wildfires going on actually in France and in Spain. So can you tell us whether they're different or are they being driven by the same factors?
So first of all, good morning. Thank you for having me here. The underlying factors, are almost the same because as we know, Europe is currently being hit with a massive heat wave. And we also recognize the same, last year when England, the same thing happens. The problem with this are, when this kind of massive heat wave hits, so you have impending, droughts everywhere, and then the fuels are dried faster and are ripe to burn. The moisture of the fuels goes down rapidly, and it can sustain a rapid and faster fire spread. And extreme fire behaviors are more seen during these situations.
All right. There are mass evacuations underway, said to be the largest since World War II. Talk to us about the biggest challenges in moving people safely and also deciding when they can return. And also, can all this evacuation necessarily reduce containment capacity?
So the evacuation actually, there is no guarantee it can restrain, containment capacity because it purely depends on the, local climatic conditions and the firefighters' efforts, or any, additional fuel breaks, etc., laid on the path of the fire. But coming to the evacuation process in particular, since it's a mass scale movement of people, you have to actually provide, food, shelter, etc. for them. Let them, know the updates. Also let them know what are the safe evacuation routes from their homes to a nearby, shelter or camps, right? And in addition to that, once the wildfire threat is gone, before settling them back to their homes, an extensive, post-wildfire condition analysis has to be done because most of these homes where, are in the path of the fire can also be affected by smoke. Which can also affect the air quality of these homes. For example, at least in the US, we have a lot of homes built of, wood, and then there are gypsum boards inside them which can absorb, contaminants from the smoke. And once the smoke has gone, the fresh air comes in and the absorbed contaminants, are released back into the fresh air as well. So people should also, and the government should also take this into consideration when they are, moving people back to their homes after the wildfire and the smoke has passed to ensure that, the air quality levels are good and what are the safe conditions before bringing them back into their homes.
Okay, I hear you, Professor. When I read about these wildfires, two words come up. Unpredictability is one I've heard very often. The other one that's more recent is fire cloud. So I'm trying to understand, when you put the two and two together, what does it mean for firefighters on the ground? I mean, given the unpredictability, what is it that they can no longer use that they might usually use to plan their evacuation or containment strategies? And also whether you think they're trained and equipped for this in Europe?
So normally, all the understanding we have in fire spread, on wildfires are basically limited to, normal conditions, where the weather is, the winds are at a particular velocity and you have a normal, fire spread. But conditions as these fall under a class of categories called as extreme fire behavior. So where the wildfire spreads rapidly, depending on, say, for example, a hurricane which is passing by, which can, inject intense winds to rapidly escalate the fire spread. And an additional phenomena which you were talking about is the pyrocumulonimbus cloud. So basically, this condition exists similar to how there is a volcanic eruption, for example. The intense heat source which the wildfire produces, heats up the air which is near the ground, and this long convective columns of air or the hot plumes plus air, just goes high into the atmosphere to form these large pyrocumulonimbus clouds. And under extreme conditions, these clouds can be strong enough that they can directly shoot into the stratosphere and spread wildfire over long distances. So once these clouds, become strong enough, they can also sustain ember transport over a very long distances, which can subsequently induce spot fires at different locations, even far from the main fire line. And these clouds are, what we call in research as, wildfire, can create their own fire behavior. So these are not like normal clouds as we see. They have water vapor, which are then condensed on the wildfire, the smoke particulates inside. And then occasionally when the conditions are conducive, they can rain down those embers at long distances as well.
It's fascinating, and it's really quite frightening,
so
these conditions that you're describing to us, Dr. Kumaran. I want to talk about the future. President Emmanuel Macron, he's promised a full review of the crisis. How do you suggest France and Spain prepare for wildfires becoming recurring emergencies? And you mentioned examples earlier from the UK. There's also, the California Palisades fire that I recall as well. Are there lessons to be drawn from that?
Right. So as far as my suggestion is concerned, France, Spain, and European countries on the whole should make, wildfire containment and resilience approach into their national policies. I'm not aware about most of their policies, but there can be something there. But this is something definitely to be looked upon. So in future, as more and more people move into the wild and urban interface areas, as these areas expand, we should also think about how to design these wild and urban interface areas better, such that the homes are more resilient to fire. And if in case of a fire spread, how it can be mitigated or how evacuations can be carried out safely. The design of wild and urban interface and a country's resilience to long-term wildfire threat should be included in the national while designing the national disaster policy as well. So that's my take on it.
Understood. Professor, thank you so much for explaining that to us. Dr. S. Muthu Kumaran is Assistant Research Professor at the Department of Fire Protection Engineering at Worcester Polytechnic Institute.